Sandra Bullock walked into a quiet restaurant in Los Angeles. It was a beautiful place, with soft music playing and expensive lights hanging from the ceiling. The chairs were covered in smooth leather, and the tables were shining like glass. It was a place where rich people came to eat in peace. Most of the customers wore fancy clothes. Some were business people, some were celebrities, but everyone acted calm and quiet. Sandra didn't come with bodyguards or assistants. She wore simple jeans, a black shirt, and sunglasses to hide her face. She liked to be normal sometimes, even though she was a big movie star. She didn't want special attention. She just wanted to enjoy her lunch and wait for a friend. She picked a corner table and sat down. She looked around and smiled politely at the people nearby, but most of them didn't recognize her right away. A waiter came to take her order. He was young and had a sharp look in his eyes. He noticed Sandra but didn't treat her like someone important. Maybe he thought she was just another regular customer. He didn't smile, he just asked, "What would you like to order?" Sandra gave a kind smile and replied softly, "Just water for now. I'm waiting for a friend." The waiter nodded and walked away quickly without saying much. Outside the restaurant, the streets were full of people walking by. Cars moved slowly, and horns beeped in the distance. Near the glass door of the restaurant stood a little girl. Her hair was messy, and her clothes were old and dirty. She had no shoes, her feet were dusty, and her small hands held a plastic cup with a few coins in it. She looked inside the restaurant with big, tired eyes, watching the food on the tables and the happy people eating. Some people saw the girl but turned their faces away. A few guests near the window looked uncomfortable. A waiter near the entrance frowned and tried to wave her off. He didn't want the girl to stand near the door, because it looked bad for a classy place like this. But the girl didn't move. She kept standing there, looking hungry and cold. Her eyes stopped at Sandra's table, and for a moment, their eyes met. Sandra felt something deep in her chest. She knew that look, the look of hunger, sadness, and silent hope. Without thinking twice, she stood up and walked to the door. The guests stared as she opened the door and bent down to the little girls level. Sandra smiled and said gently, "Hi, sweetie, are you hungry?" The girl nodded slowly, her eyes wide with surprise. Sandra held her hand and said, "Come with me." The waiter at the front tried to stop her. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" he asked with confusion. Sandra simply nodded. "Yes, she's with me." She guided the girl to her table and helped her sit down. The girl sat quietly, not sure if this was real or a dream. She looked around the fancy restaurant, afraid someone might yell at her, but Sandra placed a napkin on her lap and gave her a warm smile. "It's okay, you're safe here." When the waiter returned with the glass of water, he noticed the girl. He looked surprised and uncomfortable. He didn't say anything at first, but his face showed disapproval. Sandra ignored him and picked up the menu. "She have a sandwich, some fries, and orange juice," she said calmly, "and maybe a slice of cake if she wants." The waiter wrote the order without a smile and walked away quickly. As the little girl waited for the food, she looked at Sandra with wide eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Sandra gently touched her hand. "You don't have to thank me. Everyone deserves to eat, no matter what." The girl lowered her head. But she smiled for the first time that day. Her eyes were still full of questions, but her stomach was starting to feel hope instead of pain. Around them, people in the restaurant began to whisper. Some were confused, some looked annoyed. One woman in a fancy dress whispered to her husband, "Why is she feeding that street girl here?" A man at another table looked at his phone, realizing who Sandra Bullock was. "Is that Sandra Bullock?" he whispered to his friend. Slowly, more and more guests began to recognize her, and their expressions changed, but Sandra didn't care. She wasn't doing this for attention. She didn't take out her phone or post anything online. She just wanted to help one hungry child. That was all. The girl started to relax. Her shoulders dropped, and her small hands stopped shaking. For the first time in a long time, she felt like she mattered. The restaurant's soft music continued to play, and the world outside moved on. But at that one table, something quiet and beautiful was happening. An act of kindness that didn't need words or cameras. Just one heart seeing another, and offering love with no conditions. The little girl sat very still at the table, afraid to move too much. She had never been in a place like this before. The chairs were soft, the table was clean, and everything smelled like fresh bread and warm food. Her eyes moved around quickly, watching people eat with silver forks and shining glasses. She held her hands tightly in her lap, afraid that if she touched something, someone might shout at her. Sandra Bullock sat across from her, smiling softly. She didn't speak too much. She didn't want to scare the girl. She just waited patiently for the food to come. Every now and then, she glanced toward the door, hoping Keanu Reeves would arrive soon. But at that moment, all her focus was on the girl sitting in front of her. The waiter came back with the food. His face still looked cold and uncomfortable. He placed the plate of food in front of the girl without saying a word. Then he gave a short look at Sandra, as if silently asking, "Are you sure about this?" Sandra ignored him and softly said, "Thank you." The waiter walked away quickly. Shaking his head, the little girl stared at the plate. There was a warm sandwich, a pile of golden fries, and a glass of orange juice with ice. The smell made her stomach growl loudly. She looked up at Sandra nervously. "Can I really eat this?" she asked in a quiet voice. Sandra nodded. "Yes, sweetie. It's all yours." With careful hands, the girl picked up the sandwich and took a bite. Her eyes widened and she smiled. "It's so good," she whispered. She took another bite. Then another. She hadn't eaten proper food in days, maybe weeks. Her little fingers moved fast as she ate, and crumbs fell on her lap, but she didn't care. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't hungry. Sandra watched her with warm eyes. She didn't interrupt or ask questions. She let the girl eat in peace. Every now and then, Sandra would gently push the glass of juice closer or hand her a napkin. People in the restaurant continued to stare. Some whispered, others pretended not to look, but everyone noticed what was happening. A woman sitting at the next table leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Why is Sandra Bullock feeding a homeless kid in here?" Her husband replied, "Maybe it's for a movie, or maybe she's just being nice." Another man across the room took out his phone and snapped a photo. Trying to be sneaky, others just watched. Confused or curious, the girl finished the sandwich and looked at the fries. Her hands were greasy, but she didn't stop. She ate until the plate was almost empty. Then she picked up the glass of juice and drank quickly. The cold drink made her smile again. For a few moments, she forgot she was poor. She forgot she was dirty and alone. She felt like a normal child, sitting in a nice place with someone who cared. Sandra finally spoke. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated. "It's Lily," she said softly. Sandra smiled. "That's a beautiful name." Lily blushed and looked down. Sandra continued, "How old are you?" Lily raised 4 fingers. "I think I'm 9, she said. Sandra nodded. "You're very brave." Suddenly, a loud laugh came from a table nearby. It was the waiter again, standing with 2 other staff members. They were looking at Sandra's table and whispering something. One of them laughed again and said, "Maybe next time she'll bring the whole street in here." They didn't know Sandra could hear them, but she did. Sandra's smile faded for a moment. She didn't like the way they were talking. She looked at Lily, who had also heard. The girl's smile slowly disappeared, and her shoulders became tight again. She looked down at her plate, afraid that someone was going to take the food away or ask her to leave. Sandra reached out and gently touched Lily's hand. "Don't worry," she said. "You're safe." Her voice was calm, but there was a strength behind it. Sandra had faced rude people before, but this was different. This was a child being laughed at for needing help. She turned and looked at the waiter, who quickly walked away, pretending to be busy. Sandra didn't say anything yet. She wanted to wait until Keanu arrived. He always knew what to say in moments like this. The restaurant started to get a little more quiet. People were watching more carefully now. Some of them were fans who had seen her movies. Some were just touched by what they were witnessing. A few even smiled at Sandra, as if silently saying thank you for doing something kind. But others were still judging, still whispering, still acting like kindness didn't belong in a place like this. Sandra knew she couldn't change the world in one day, but maybe she could change one life. She looked at Lily and thought, if I were in her shoes, I would want someone to notice. Me too. And so she sat there quietly, giving Lily not just food, but something even more powerful: dignity, safety, and love. The girl Lily felt something warm inside her, not just from the food, but from the way Sandra was treating her. No one had ever treated her like this before. Most people looked away when they saw her on the street. Some gave her angry looks. Some shouted at her to leave, but Sandra was different. She was sitting with her, feeding her, smiling at her like she mattered. Lily had almost finished the fries. Her little hands were messy, and her face had crumbs on it. Sandra picked up a napkin and gently wiped Lily's mouth. "There," she said with a smile. "Now you look like a princess." Lily giggled softly. She had not laughed in a long time, not real laughter, the kind that made her eyes shine. A few minutes later, the same waiter returned. He looked at the empty plates and raised an eyebrow. He didn't say anything nice. He just asked, "Anything else?" Sandra looked at Lily and said, "Would you like some dessert?" Lily's eyes grew wide. "Really? Like cake?" Sandra nodded. "Of course, what kind do you like?" Lily thought for a moment. "Chocolate," she whispered shyly. Sandra turned to the waiter and said, "We'll have one slice of your best chocolate cake, please." The waiter sighed and walked away. His footsteps were heavy. Like he was annoyed, Sandra noticed, but she stayed calm. She didn't want to make a scene, not yet, while waiting for the cake. Sandra and Lily talked a little more. Sandra asked her where she stayed. Lily said she slept behind a store most nights, sometimes under a bridge. Sandra's heart ached, but she didn't show her pain. She just listened and held Lily's hand gently. She didn't want Lily to feel embarrassed. She wanted her to feel safe when the cake arrived. It looked beautiful, soft layers with chocolate cream and a cherry on top. Lily gasped. "It's so pretty," she said. Sandra smiled. "Go ahead, it's all yours." Lily picked up the spoon and took a small bite. Her eyes lit up. "It's the best thing I ever tasted," she said. Other people in the restaurant continued to look. Some smiled, some shook their heads. A few even took quiet pictures. They didn't know what to say. This was not something they saw every day, a Hollywood star feeding a poor child. At a table meant for the rich, a young couple sitting nearby whispered to each other. "She's such a good person," the woman said. The man nodded. "Yeah, but I hope that kid doesn't cause trouble." Another person looked annoyed and muttered, "This is a fine dining place, not a charity." But none of them had the courage to say anything out loud. Not yet. The waiter came back to collect the plate. His eyes moved between the half-eaten cake and the girl's dirty hands. He couldn't hide the way he felt. He looked down at Lily, and then at Sandra, and said with a fake smile, "Is she going to clean up after herself?" His tone was rude, like a joke, but not a kind one. Sandra looked up at him slowly. Her smile disappeared. Her eyes became serious. "Excuse me?" she asked quietly. The waiter shrugged and said, "I'm just saying, we try to keep this place clean and comfortable for our usual guests." He glanced at Lily as he said the word, usual. Like she didn't belong. Lily froze. She looked down at her lap. She wanted to hide under the table. Her cheeks turned red and tears came to her eyes. Sandra saw it all. She reached out and touched Lily's hand again. "Don't listen," she whispered gently. Then she looked at the waiter again. Still calm, but now very firm. "This little girl is my guest," Sandra said clearly, loud enough for people around to hear. "She deserves respect like anyone else in this room." The waiter's fake smile faded. He didn't reply. He just took the plate and left. A quiet wave moved through the restaurant. People who had been pretending not to listen were now staring openly. Some nodded in agreement, some looked away. Feeling ashamed, Sandra leaned toward Lily and said, "You didn't do anything wrong. Don't let anyone make you feel small." Lily looked at her with wide eyes. "Why are you so nice to me?" she asked. Sandra smiled and said, "Because I see you and you matter." At that moment, the door of the restaurant opened again. A tall man in dark clothes stepped inside. He had long hair, kind eyes, and a calm smile. It was Keanu Reeves. He looked around and spotted Sandra, then noticed Lily and the people staring. He walked over slowly, not rushing, but his eyes saw everything, the half whispers, the waiter's expression, and the way Sandra held Lily's hand. Sandra smiled at him and said softly, "You came at the right time." Keanu gave a small nod. He didn't know yet what had happened, but he could feel the tension in the room. Something was about to change. Keanu Reeves walked across the restaurant with his calm and quiet steps. He didn't wear anything fancy, just a dark jacket and jeans. But still, people turned to look at him. Some guests whispered his name, surprised to see two famous stars sitting at one table. Keanu reached the table and gave Sandra a gentle smile. Then he looked at Lily, who was sitting quietly, her hands in her lap. Her eyes were still red from the rude comment the waiter had made earlier. Sandra stood up and gave him a warm hug. "I'm so glad you're here," she said softly. Keanu nodded. "Looks like I missed something important," he said, looking at Lily kindly. Sandra didn't explain right away. She just said, "This is Lily, and she's our guest today." Keanu looked at the little girl and smiled. "It's nice to meet you, Lily." Lily gave a shy smile but didn't say anything. She was nervous. She knew who was too. She had seen him on TV and in posters. She couldn't believe she was sitting with two people that the whole world loved, and yet, here they were, treating her like she was the important one. Just then, the same waiter came back to the table. He noticed Keanu and suddenly changed his expression. He smiled awkwardly. "Sir, welcome," he said politely. Keanu gave a small nod, but his eyes were sharp. The waiter added, "Would you like something to drink while you wait?" Keanu looked at Sandra. "I'll have what she's having," he said, then turned back to the waiter. "But I think you owe this young lady an apology first." The waiter blinked, confused. "I'm sorry?" he asked, pretending not to understand. Keanu leaned forward slightly and said in a calm but serious voice, "I heard what you said from the entrance, and I saw how you looked at her." He pointed gently at Lily. "That's not how we treat people." Everyone nearby turned their heads. The room went quiet. The waiter stood frozen, unsure what to do. Sandra added softly, "You mocked her just because of how she looked, but you had no idea what she's been through." Her voice was still gentle, but it held power. Lily looked down again, but Keanu leaned closer and said kindly, "You don't have to hide, Lily. You didn't do anything wrong." The waiter finally spoke. "I didn't mean to offend anyone. It was just a misunderstanding." But his words sounded weak, and no one believed him. Keanu didn't raise his voice. He didn't get angry, but his presence was enough to make the waiter feel small. Sometimes a little respect can change someone's whole day. Keanu said, "Try it next time." The waiter nodded quickly. "Yes, sir, I understand," he said, then walked away without saying another word. People around the restaurant began to whisper again, but this time the tone was different. They weren't mocking. They were surprised, even impressed. A few people clapped quietly. One woman wiped her eyes. Sandra sat back down and took Lily's hand again. "See?" she whispered. "You're not invisible anymore." Lily's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were not from sadness. They were from something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She felt seen, protected. Keanu smiled at her. "You have a strong friend here," he said, nodding toward Sandra. Lily nodded slowly. "She gave me food," she said softly. "And she sat with me," Keanu replied. "That's what good people do." Then he looked around the room and said loud enough for others to hear, "Maybe the rest of us should learn from her." The message was clear. Everyone heard it. Some people looked down in shame. Others looked at Sandra with respect. One man even got up and walked to the manager to complain about the waiter's behavior. Another woman asked the hostess if she could pay for a meal for someone in need next time. The energy in the restaurant had changed. What began as an ordinary lunch became something more. A moment of real kindness. A moment that challenged others to look at their own hearts. All because one woman had decided not to ignore a little girl standing outside a glass door. Keanu asked Lily if she wanted more juice. She smiled and nodded. Sandra waved at another server who came over and was much kinder than the first one. 2 orange juices, please, Sandra said, and the server smiled brightly. Of course, right away, he replied. Lily sipped the juice and looked at both of them. Why are you so nice to me? She asked again. Sandra smiled gently. Because everyone deserves to be treated kindly, no matter what they look like or where they come from. Keanu added, the world can be hard, but people like you remind us why it's worth fighting to make it better. And in that moment, Lily started to believe, just a little, that maybe life could be good again. The restaurant had become very quiet. Most people had stopped eating. Their eyes were on the small table where Sandra Bullock, Keanu Reeves, and a little girl were sitting. Some guests were still whispering, but now their voices were softer. There was no more laughter, no more mocking. Something had changed. The room felt different, more thoughtful, more human. Lily sat between 2 of the most famous people in the world. But she didn't feel nervous anymore. She felt safe. She kept looking at Sandra and Keanu with wonder in her eyes. She still didn't understand why they cared so much about her. She was just a poor girl who lived on the street. But they were treating her like she mattered, like she was someone important. Keanu sipped his juice and looked around the room. He could feel the stares. He didn't mind. He had been famous for a long time. But moments like this reminded him that fame meant nothing if you didn't use it to help others. He leaned toward Lily and asked, "Do you have a favorite movie?" Lily thought for a second and said, "I saw a part of one where a man flew a bus over a bridge." Sandra laughed softly. "That was me," she said. Lily's eyes grew wide. "Really?" she asked. "That was you?" Sandra nodded and smiled. "Yes, that was my first big movie." Lily giggled. "You were so cool." Keanu chuckled. "She still is," he said, and Sandra rolled her eyes playfully as they talked. The manager of the restaurant walked over. He was a tall man with a serious face, but now he looked nervous. He had heard what happened with the waiter and didn't want trouble, especially not with famous guests involved. He cleared his throat and said, "Excuse me, Miss Bullock, Mr. Reeves, may I speak with you for a moment?" Sandra looked at him calmly. "Of course," she said. The manager glanced at Lily, then looked away quickly. "First, I'd like to apologize for the behavior of our staff," he said. "It was unprofessional, and it doesn't reflect our values." Keanu nodded but didn't smile. "I hope you mean that," he said gently, "because what happened was wrong and it hurt someone." The manager nodded quickly. "Yes, I understand," he said. "We'll speak to the waiter and make sure this doesn't happen again." Sandra added, "This little girl was treated badly just because she looked different and didn't wear fancy clothes." Her voice was soft but firm. But kindness should not depend on how someone looks. The manager looked embarrassed. "You're right," he said. "I'm truly sorry. And I thank you for reminding us of what really matters." He turned to Lily and said, "Young lady, you are always welcome here." Lily gave a small smile, but she still held Sandra's hand tightly. The manager then said, "Please, today's meal is on the house." Sandra shook her head. "Thank you, but we'll pay," she said. "We're not doing this for free food," Keanu added. "Just treat people better next time. That's all we ask." The manager nodded and walked away quietly across the restaurant. A few people started clapping softly. Others followed. It wasn't loud or wild, but it was real. They weren't clapping because of the fame. They were clapping because of the message. A small act of kindness had turned into something much bigger. A teenage girl stood up from her table and walked over to Sandra. She looked nervous but said, "Miss Bullock, I just want to say thank you. What you did today, it really inspired me." Sandra smiled and replied, "Thank you for saying that." The girl then looked at Lily and said, "You're really brave." Lily smiled shyly and whispered, "Thank you, soon." A few more guests came by the table. Not for photos or autographs, but to say thank you. One man said, "I was having a bad day, but this reminded me to look outside myself." Another woman said, "I teach children, and this moment will stay with me." Sandra and Keanu thanked them all, but kept their attention on Lily. Lee looked around and saw people smiling at her. Instead of ignoring her, she didn't feel invisible anymore. She felt seen, valued, like her life meant something. Sandra leaned down and said, "You did something special today, Lily." Lily blinked. "Me?" she asked. "But I didn't do anything." Keanu smiled. "You reminded us what kindness looks like." The air inside the restaurant felt warm now, not just from the food, but from the hearts that had opened up. For a little girl who had only come looking for something to eat, she had found something much bigger: hope, love, and a moment she would never forget. And for Sandra and Keanu, this wasn't just a kind act. It was a quiet fight against cruelty, a simple stand for what's right. In a world full of noise, they chose to speak through action, and their message was heard by everyone. The quiet moment in the restaurant slowly began to feel like something special. It was not just a normal lunch anymore. Something had changed, and everyone could feel it. People were no longer just customers sitting at different tables. They had seen something real, something that touched their hearts. Lily sat calmly now. She wasn't afraid anymore. Her hands were still a little shaky, but she felt warm inside. Sandra Bullock and Keanu Reeves were sitting with her, not as movie stars, but as kind people who cared. She kept looking at their faces to make sure it wasn't a dream. Sandra reached into her bag and pulled out a small napkin. She gently wiped a spot of chocolate from Lily's cheek. "There you go," she whispered with a smile. Keanu looked at the half-full glass of juice and said, "Would you like a refill?" Lily nodded slowly. "Yes, please," she answered politely. Her voice was small, but stronger than before. A different waiter came now, not the one who had insulted Lily. This one had kind eyes and a friendly smile. "More juice for the little princess?" he asked. Lily gave a tiny laugh and nodded. The waiter returned in a minute and gave her the glass carefully. "Here you go," he said warmly. "Enjoy." Keanu leaned back in his chair, watching how things were changing. He noticed that other guests were no longer looking at Lily with judgment. Some were even smiling at her. One man waved gently, and a woman gave her a thumbs up. Lily smiled back shyly. Still holding Sandra's hand, Sandra took a deep breath and looked at Keanu. "Sometimes it only takes one act of kindness," she said quietly. Keanu nodded. "And one brave little girl to remind people what matters." They both looked at Lily, who was now sipping her juice slowly, as if trying to make the moment last. The restaurant manager came back, but this time with a small gift bag. "We'd like to give this to the young lady," he said. "It's just some cookies and a scarf." Lily looked surprised and turned to Sandra. "Can I take it?" she asked. Sandra smiled. "Of course, it's for you." Lily reached out and took the bag carefully, like it was treasure. "Thank you," she said to the manager. Her words were soft but clear. The manager gave a polite smile and nodded before walking away. Sandra looked at Lily and said, "You've got a strong voice. You should use it more." Lily smiled proudly. "I will," she said. Keanu looked around and then said, "You know, I've been to many places in my life, met many people, but moments like this, they stay with you." Sandra nodded. "This one will stay with me forever," she said. "It started with a glass door and a hungry child, and now look at this." Lily looked at them both. "Are you going to leave soon?" she asked. Her voice had a tiny tremble. She didn't want this moment to end. Sandra took her hand again. "Not yet," she said. "We still have a few minutes," Keanu added. "Besides, we haven't taken a picture together yet." Lily's eyes lit up. "Really? A picture?" Sandra smiled and pulled out her phone. "Let's make a memory," she said. The three of them leaned in close, and Sandra held the phone up. "Say cheese," she whispered. Lily giggled and said, "Cheese." The camera clicked. The photo showed 3 smiling faces, 2 famous and 1 small, but none more important than the other. Sandra looked at the picture and said, "You look beautiful." Lily blushed. "Thank you," she whispered. Keanu looked at the photo too. "I think this should go in a magazine," he joked. "Hollywood stars and the real star of the day." Lily laughed, and for the first time, her laughter was loud and full of joy. The sound of it made people at nearby tables smile without even knowing why outside the restaurant. People were walking by, unaware of the special moment happening inside. But inside, something powerful had taken place. One act of kindness had opened many hearts. One poor girl had shown everyone what real strength looked like. Sandra looked at the clock. "We'll have to go soon," she said softly. Lily's face fell a little. "Can I see you again?" she asked. Sandra squeezed her hand. "We'll try," she said gently. "But no matter what, I want you to remember this day. You are strong, you are kind, and you are never alone," Keanu added. "And you are part of our story now." Lily looked at both of them, tears forming again in her eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for everything." As Sandra and Keanu stood up to leave, the restaurant was silent again. Not from discomfort, but from respect. People watched them walk past, and some nodded in thanks. Lily stayed at the table, holding the small gift bag close to her chest, her heart full, her spirit stronger than ever. Sandra and Keanu stood near the entrance of the restaurant, getting ready to leave. But they didn't walk away right away. They both looked back at Lily, who was still sitting at the table, holding the gift bag close to her chest. Her eyes were wide and full of light. She didn't look scared anymore. She looked strong. Like something inside her had changed. The people in the restaurant were still watching. But now it was different. They weren't judging her anymore. They were thinking, maybe even learning something. A few of them smiled at her, and Lily smiled back. Shy but proud, Keanu leaned closer to Sandra and whispered, "That girl will never forget today." Sandra nodded. "And I won't either," she said. "It's strange how something small, like sharing a meal, can mean so much." Keanu looked thoughtful. "Sometimes it's the small things that change everything." Sandra took out a pen from her bag and walked back to Lily's table. She gently took one of the paper napkins and wrote something on it. Then she folded it and placed it in Lily's hand. "What is it?" Lily asked, looking curious. Sandra smiled. "It's my number, in case you ever need help." Lily held the napkin like it was made of gold. "Really?" she asked. "You're giving it to me?" Sandra nodded. "Yes, but only for important things, okay?" Lily promised. "Okay, I won't waste it." Sandra leaned down and kissed the top of her head. "I know you won't." Keanu stepped forward and reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small silver coin with a star on it. It wasn't money. It was something he kept for good luck. "This is for you," he said. "Whenever you feel alone or afraid, hold it tight and remember this moment." Lily looked at the coin in her hand and held it close. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll never forget this." Sandra and Keanu smiled at her one last time and began walking toward the door. As they reached the exit, the same waiter who had mocked Lily earlier was standing nearby. He looked embarrassed. He didn't say anything, but his eyes showed regret. Keanu paused in front of him and said quietly, "Next time, treat every person like they matter, even if they don't look rich." The waiter nodded. Too ashamed to reply, Sandra didn't even look at the waiter. She just held her head high and walked out with Keanu. The glass door closed behind them. But the memory of what had happened remained inside that restaurant. And memory of what had happened remained inside that restaurant. The sun was still shining and the street was busy, but for Sandra and Keanu, the world felt a little brighter. Sandra took a deep breath. "Do you think she'll be okay?" she asked. Keanu looked up at the sky. "She's stronger than most adults I know," he said. "She'll be okay." Inside, Lily sat alone at the table. but she didn't feel alone, not anymore. She touched the coin in her pocket and held the napkin with both hands. The cake was gone, the juice was finished, but her heart was full. She looked around at the people, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a stranger. She felt seen. One of the kind waiters came over and asked, "Do you want to take anything with you?" Lily thought for a second, and then pointed to the rest of the cookies from her gift bag. "Can I save these for later?" she asked. The waiter smiled. "Of course you can." Lily stood up from her seat and walked slowly toward the door. Her steps were small, but steady. She passed the same people who had once stared at her like she didn't belong, but now their eyes were different. Softer, some nodded at her, some smiled. One woman even clapped quietly as Lily walked past us. Lily opened the door. She turned around one last time and looked at the restaurant. It had been just a building before, with walls and lights and expensive food. But now it was something more. It was the place where someone saw her, listened to her, and gave her more than food. They gave her hope. She stepped outside into the sunshine. Her hands were full. Her heart was full. She looked down the street and saw Sandra and Keanu walking side by side. People didn't notice them. They just looked like two normal friends enjoying the day. But to Lily, they were heroes. Lily didn't run after them. She didn't shout their names. She just watched for a moment, smiled, and then turned the other way. She had a long walk ahead, but now she had something more important, a reason to walk, a reason to hope. And as she walked, people who passed her didn't seem so scary anymore. She stood straighter. She held the coin in one hand and the napkin in the other. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but she knew this. She mattered, and someone cared.